Greetings and welcome back to another iteration of MGTOW Talks, and guess who? I'm here again with our furry friend Teal Deer to talk about social constructs, whatever the fuck those are. Now, this conversation was born of a thread that I unintentionally started on one of his videos about language possibly being a social construct, and long story short, it turned into about 200 comments, not my intention. And then we kind of came up with the idea of, why don't we talk about this topic of social constructs? And, of course, it's a very popular term used amongst SJWs and severe leftists. So I'll just let Teal there take over now. And, yeah.
Yeah, basically, we sort of... I suppose I should explain the background of it a little bit. I released a video about a social construct fallacy, or this idea that some people will often argue against a point or simply try and dismiss it by stating that, oh, this thing is just a social construct, and therefore, you shouldn't pay any attention to it or give it any credence. And one of the examples I gave was this idea that language has, or is basically a social construct, insofar as we kind of just vocalize a bunch of sounds, and we've sort of agreed quite artificially and arbitrarily on what those sounds mean. To which you then pointed out, quite correctly, that actually language is sort of a faculty of biology, in that human beings as a species will always vocalize. We have this ability for vocal communication, and that it will always manifest itself. I believe you actually had an example of a girl who was raised in almost virtual isolation, but she still sort of vocalized despite having never really been interacted with.
Yeah, the case, I believe it was Jenny. Her name was Jenny in the 70s, and linguists had studied this. She was basically locked away in a cellar, barely fed, up until about 13. That's when the authorities discovered her. And, yeah, she never acquired language, or in this case, English. And she was past what linguists call the critical period. But she could grunt, so she did grunt, but she could never formulate complete words or sentences.
Yeah, and this sort of led to the point about language acquisition. So even though she hadn't developed a language as would necessarily be recognized by us now, she'd still acquired language to some extent. And this is the point that sort of I was getting at when I mentioned language being a social construct. That basically what we have is, effectively, you and I at the moment are grunting at each other, just in a very sophisticated and extrapolated way over the centuries of development. And that's the sort of point that I was getting at with this idea that language could be a social construct. But when you sort of combine those 2 points, you look at it and you realize that the term social construct is somewhat an inadequacy, isn't it, really? Because it's not entirely this arbitrary benchmark thing. It's something that has still been extrapolated out of a biological origin.
Not only that, at least to my view, when I think of social construct, I think of intention. I think of people intending to go about making something, constructing something, and that's just clearly not the case with human language. There's no intention about there. No one's sitting around a table saying, I guess dog means dog because whatever. So social construct, I just find it, I don't like the term at all, because it, once again, it's this idea, I got the sense in that thread that people were calling things, say, language a social construct because language has a social context, which it absolutely does. In fact, you can't acquire language without a social context in other human beings, but that doesn't make it a social construct, ultimately.
And this is something which I actually sort of during the week had a bit of a discussion with a few colleagues of mine, and we were sort of looking at this idea of either can we differentiate a faculty of biology from a social construct, or should we maybe perhaps look at pursuing some terms in between? So we looked at things like what would be a direct faculty of biology, which you would sort of look at like the basic structure of the human body. Now, no amount of social interaction is going to drastically change the human body, not short term anyway. We may exhibit preferences in regards to breeding for height or skin color or hair color or eye color or anything like that. But it's not going to massively change how the human body is structured. You're still going to have a spinal column, 4 limbs, skull, ribs, and so on and so forth. And from there, we sort of looked at, well, what can we then extrapolate out going towards this idea of a social construct, this idea of something which is totally arbitrarily defined by humans? And we sort of came up with like 2 tiers in between. It's terribly rigid way of looking at it, considering it's a constant continuum all the way through. But we've kind of sort of narrowed down 2 sort of main categories, which I'd like to sort of run by you and just get an opinion on, really. We looked at one and we said, well, what about, say, a biosocial construct? The idea of having a social function that was specifically built on a biological basis. For example, the acquisition of language. It is a necessity for human beings to vocalize. It's a faculty that we have, that we're born with, and that you will always use regardless of how you're raised. It's something that will always manifest. You never have to be formally taught it, but it will always come out there. And then the other one we looked at was this idea of a socio-bio construct, the idea that there may be examples of biological functions that have not necessarily either developed, but have certainly been informed by social influence in this feedback loop that we keep talking about here. And we looked at an example of this and said, well, why did human beings lose a vast amount of their body hair when they went from, obviously, ape to what we now consider to be human? And we sort of theorized that part of this might be a socio-biological construct, this idea that it was either aesthetically pleasing or that it helped to further the species by enabling us to better recognize facial expressions and to help with general facial recognition. And so that is how that would come about.
Yeah, well, I think getting back to the feedback loop, and I think that's the key, we as humans were continually stuck in this tendency to dichotomize things into 2 opposite poles, whereas most of what is human is a feedback loop. I mean, this constant, it's an artificial debate, faux debate between nature versus nurture. I mean, the reality is, for example, human morphological adaptations are a response to the environment, and without an environment, there will be no adaptive change. But once the changes are in place, they're there. So this would apply, I think, to just everything across the board with humans. Maybe to varying degrees. You might have in some cases, more environment than sort of biology, what you just start with. But you're kind of always going back and forth in a feedback loop. And I think the example you had offered previously, which seems so distantly related, about, say, driving an automobile, which our ancestors didn't do that. There were no automobiles, no roadways. That we enforce rules that, yes, it's there are socially constructed rules, but they're reflective of our basic biology and our need to sort of get along and not kill each other and somehow not have too many accidents. So once again, you have this feedback loop, and by polarizing things, you really lose that, and you can't really see what's going on. And that's absolutely true of language, and I think just about everything else that human beings do.
Yeah, now driving is one which I find very interesting, because it's one of those things that you look at and you think, well, this is totally artificial, surely. It's a process invented by humans in an environment invented by humans with a rule set invented by humans. Surely it must be entirely a construct of society. But then you look at it and you think, well, no, actually, driving and all of the laws and rules around it are still subject to basic Darwinian evolution. It's somewhat an extrapolation of, from what I can tell, 2 quite interesting theories within evolutionary psychology. The niche construction theory, the idea that animals will change their environment to suit them, and that if the mutation within the species that led to that behavior of adapting your environment was beneficial, then obviously that genetic tendency would be passed on, so that the children of that animal that did that would be more likely to exhibit the same behavior. Or if there are social species, the children may learn it as well as have it being genetically reinforced. And it kind of combined quite nicely with, I think it's called multi-level selection. The idea that being altruistic is actually sort of quite a selfish act, because although you're trading your time and effort and resource now, you're still hoping to get it for return in the future to basically to buy more time to effectively pass on your own genes. Whether you do or not is subject to a whole load of other stresses that don't really matter. But that's sort of where it was going. And it's so while driving might be considered a social construct in this idea, in that it's entirely artificially designed by consensus and committee of people, it's still subject to that basic Darwinian evolution. The rules are there to preserve us and therefore buy our genes more time to reproduce. And the rules around it, the laws that we have, are still subject to the basic principles of evolution, because good changes that we have, good changes that we make to the law, like, say, having a set speed limit or, say, lowering a speed limit, obviously propagated good changes because more people lived, whereas bad changes, if we made one by saying, like, there's no such thing as lanes, you can just drive wherever the hell you want, would result in more people getting injured, and therefore they would be dismissed and removed. So it's still subject to this basic Darwinian evolution. So it's quite interesting when you consider it like that, because it then seems that these, quote, social constructs, the way we actually approach them, it's the same mode of attack that we would use in regards to faculties of biology.
Well, yeah, and previously I had mentioned that you get something like an office building and office work, and you're on a tight schedule and you have deadlines and you're working excessive hours. Now, this might all seem very artificial and being socially constructed, the kind of job you're doing, the responsibilities you have, and indeed even if the product is in demand. Let's say you work on printers, I don't know, that's very artificial, but the physiology, the chemistry going on when you're under stress or duress is identical. You're going to be pumping out corticosteroids, specifically cortisol. You're going to be pumping out norepinephrine, adrenaline in some cases. It's identical, more or less, to 40,000 years ago running away from a cave lion in Europe or something. The difference being you are either killed and eaten, presumably, or you escaped, and your levels, these chemicals being pumped out go back to normal levels. Whereas in modernity, you have this constant, all these constant stressors. It never ends. And I mean, so much of civilizational sickness and disease comes from stress. And it just goes to show how all of it does ultimately go back to our biology. We can change our environment, but our physiology is going to react to that environment, not necessarily in a different way, but in a way, or rather in a question of degrees. So, how much of these corticosteroids are going to be pumped out versus how little, and that's kind of how our bodies interact with the environment. And we can go back and we can look at how the body works to get an idea of how it used to work and how it works now. Another example I would give is, video games. Perfect social construction. A bunch of guys developing things on this artificially constructed screen with a keyboard and this thing we call a mouse. Totally bizarre. So take the appeal of something like Call of Duty, which I don't play. I hate it, but I know it's very popular. I mean, that game is all about pumping out dopamine, reward systems, mostly for males. Kill lots of guys, have a good KD. You're going to react to it in a positive way. And I don't know if they've actually done studies on this specific aspect, but we know that in, say, male and male competition, when a male wins out in something, whatever it might be, he tends to have elevated testosterone levels, and the loser lower. Maybe I would actually assume that's the same case in, say, competitive online shooters as well. So we have this feedback loop, so we can create as many artificial things as possible, but we're still governed by the physiological laws, if you will, that we were subject to tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that that should come up, because it basically says that everything that we're doing is in many ways just still stimulating sort of quite a primitive part of our brain, and that this is somewhat an inescapable part of being human. And this is why I think in some cases we need to sort of be able to put a pin in what exactly is this idea of a social construct, because it seems that no matter how artificial an environment, no matter how artificial an experience, it's still going to be playing basically down to human biology, because, well, you always have to be there. The human always has to be there. Therefore, the biology is always going to come into it. So I think in regards to this idea of social constructs, we have to look at it, maybe consider how far removed does it have to be sort of from a natural origin without making the appeal to nature fallacy for us to call it something that is constructed socially.
Well, I think, you can... I don't have a problem, for example, identifying, say, writing as something that's been socially constructed. It was devised, it was invented originally in ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia, for inventory, to keep track of things. It served a purpose. Was this artificial? Sure, but it is a derivative of language, so it's just that cutoff line seems very difficult to find out or to ascertain. But one thing I think is important to talk about is the background of where all this social construct, in my view, silliness comes from.
Mm.
And it's basically a push for the blank slate, which my subs at least have heard me talk about many times. And of course, Steven Pinker even wrote a book by that title. But this idea that we start off as blank slates, and the famous 18th century French political philosopher Rousseau, in The Social Contract, the very first sentence of the book, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. So this idea that, you're born free of all constraints, but it's society and the environment that imposes absolute limits on you. And of course, in the 19th and early 20th century, a lot of bad science, pseudoscience like phrenology and eugenics and things like that, led a lot of academics to just go the opposite direction, where they proclaimed, well, nothing has enabled biology. We're infinitely malleable and moldable, and let's get rid of all of this. And it really is kind of an appeal to emotion more than anything else. And this throughout in almost every scientific discipline, from neuroscience and my background, linguistics, this has just been refuted. This is just not the case. We're not blank slates. We have innateness in us. We have innate biological faculties that interact with an environment. After all, if we had no innate biological faculties, there would be no interaction, right? You need the environment can't have an influence on a nothing, which is what a lot of people propose.
Mm.
So I think it's really important to mention that.
Absolutely. And I think another really important point to get across to this is, I know a lot of the social justice types, they like to go on about, the neuroplasticity and how the brain can change and adapt to anything. It's like, yes, that certainly is the case, but you still need to have a baseline point for that. And one really important thing to realize is that the baseline point is not the same from individual to individual. And the simple explanation for that is, if that was the case, if all behavior was inherently genetic and all genes manifested in the same way, so it was all entirely predictable, your species would go extinct, because there would be no biogenetic diversity. There would be no ability to adapt to anything. And then you sort of tie that into, again, this concept of neuroplasticity, something which I've noticed a lot of the social justice types, they like to throw at people who talk about evolutionary psychology like they've never heard of it, even though it's kind of one of the important cornerstones of the actual study.
Well, I showed you just earlier this concept of neurosexism, which up until recently, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I couldn't believe people believe that, or at least they pretend to believe it. This idea that, for example, sex differences in the brain, which have been studied over and over and over again, and we know that there are differences, generally speaking, between men and women's brains and how they operate. This is just a product of sort of gendered or sexed science or sexed neuroscience, and it's pretty insane. And going back to what you just said, the very existence of exceptions confirm rules. if there were no exceptions, there would be no majority. So they simply lose track of that. And what I mentioned prior, of course, was social justice warriors and far leftists just love talking about, say, the innateness or the genetic quality of, say, homosexuality or transgenderism when it suits them, right? And the minute it doesn't suit them, they just throw it out the window. They're not looking to get an overall consistent picture. There's just, okay, homosexuality is genetic and hormonal causes, great. But everything else, forget about it.
It does seem to be a blatant contradiction, doesn't it? Yes, homosexuality is a genetic thing, they're born that way and so on and so forth. Heterosexuality is a heteronormative social construct of the patriarchy. What?
Yeah, these guys just thrive on internal contradiction, and I don't think they even notice. If they do notice, they don't care. Which personally leads me to believe that a lot of these people are active in SJWism and far left politics or whatever. I find it really hard to believe that they believe this stuff. Maybe some of them, a lot of them do, but it's just so kooky sometimes. I'm a bit skeptical.
Well, it's the same point to do with religion, isn't it? I mean, you'd look at it and you would say, well, how could anyone possibly believe this? And yet they will continue to do so. I mean, a perfect example of this was I was talking to some Jehovah's Witnesses about a month ago, and they made the mistake of asking me the question, why do we get old? I said, do you really want me to answer that? I was like, okay, I will. Got myself my trusty pen and paper and sat and drew them out a strand of DNA and drew out all the chromosomes in the cells, and it was like, okay, well, you have all of this within your cells here. It splits, it replicates itself, because that's how genes work. And every time it reproduces itself, it has these things called telomeres on the end. Every time it reproduces, it effectively shortens itself, getting rid of the junk repeated information over and over and over again until it gets to a point where all this junk is gone, so you're only left with the original strain, at which point the cell can't reproduce, so any damage done to it past that point is permanent. And they just looked at me and said, everything you've said has just gone straight over my head. It's like, that's why you believe in God. Because you don't understand this.
Yeah. Well, it's not particularly complicated. It's not like quantum physics. It's weird. Yeah. But I think that's my, getting back to the social construct, this is just my issue. It's born of a desire to deny that there's anything such as a human nature, and that virtually everything is a social context is obvious. Like I said, natural language cannot be acquired by children without social input and interaction with other people. But most linguists, and there is some disagreement, but most linguists these days, a majority of them believe that we have an innate sort of language learning, acquiring algorithm. And without this algorithm, and they've run lots of experiments to test this, without this algorithm, it simply wouldn't be possible. So we have this degree of innateness. Once again, in the case of Jeannie, or I think it was Jeannie, yes, she did try to grunt, but she lacked her grunts lacked syntax. They lacked semantics, all these things. And so, yeah, you have a social context, but we absolutely have, say, innate capacity to acquire language. And although we haven't discovered the exact areas of the brain that would represent this learning algorithm, if you will, it's almost certainly present, because there's no other explanation to explain this. I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but I feel it might be illustrative. One hypothesis that is very much supported in linguistic community is called the poverty of stimulus. The idea is that children don't get enough stimulus in terms of the entirety of the syntax of a language and the rules to actually perform at the level they do without some sort of innate mechanism that helps compensate and sort of adjust these things. And the other one is recursion. Recursion is something you'll find in mathematics and in linguistics or in language. It's the possibility of creating sort of infinite embedded layers of sentences, which you can't get in the hypothesis, and it seems very likely, is that we can't really get enough exposure to human language to basically create an infinite chain of sentence. Mary said that John loved her, but then he denied it because he ate a hamburger and he had indigestion. I mean, so you can just keep on going and going and going. So there's very strong evidence for the degree of innateness in language acquisition. But yeah, you need a social context for it. But I just see this feedback loop, and I think based on what I've studied throughout the years and my amateur interest in evolutionary biology and psychology, it also just seems that basically everything we do as human beings is part of this feedback loop between an environment that is changing and I wouldn't say a fixed biology, but a much more sort of semi-permanent biology that is very slow to evolve. And, and we see this in civilization with stress, morbid obesity, all these things. These are maladaptations. And that's the thing about these social constructivists and SJWs is I don't get is that some of this stuff is right in front of their faces. 20,000 years ago, it's almost certain there were no cases of morbid obesity. Could it be that we have a tendency to, for example, store body fat because in times of emergency or dearth or not having enough access to food, we would use those reserves? And could it be that we have an excess of food around the corner at the supermarket and it's cheap and it's crap and it's not particularly good for you, but it's calorically dense? I mean, all these things, it just flies by them, and that they're so entrenched in our society and seem to have so much say is beyond me. But I'll stop talking now.
No, it's fine, but it raises an interesting point, and it's the point which I see a lot of them making quite frequently. Now, I've not necessarily heard some of the larger larger sides of the social justice making this, but it's a response that always seems to crop up in any comment section on any article or video or anything to do with it. And it's the age-old, we don't live in the wild anymore, therefore argument. It's the, we're not monkeys, therefore we shouldn't behave this way anymore. And I look at it and I just think, you're basically turning the human into the divine here. You're not acknowledging that you have an ancestral origin somewhere else and that there will be inherently genetic carryover. Even things which might not seem beneficial anymore will still, these genes will come along for the ride, simply because they're attached to other genes which replicated because they were more beneficial. You're not going to get rid of them, such as, our genetic predisposition to store body fat. We don't need to, but it's not going to go away. It's a gene that's here for the ride.
Well, it's just another case of the principle of human exceptionalism, right? You see it in religion in a different way, but with SJWs and their ilk, it's we're special, we're different, and all this stuff that applies to our ancestors and some of our closest relatives, such as chimpanzees and gorillas, this doesn't apply to us. We're out of the loop. And another mistake that they commit, or error they commit, is that they don't understand of how much of their behavior is just subconscious. How much of what we do, I call it the autopilot, is just essentially behaviors that are innate to us, and we don't really question them. Why we eat certain kinds of foods. We will say, well, they taste good, but maybe we have an adaptive mechanism that allows us to know, for example, a certain kind of food might have magnesium in it, and we might require that, for example. They just presuppose that we're fully in charge of our consciousness. We know exactly what's going on. And as you said, there's no genetic legacy or inheritance. It's just we're here in the now, and it's different.
Yeah, I mean, try to explain to some of them this idea that it's like, no, when you stick a spoon into a jar of honey and put it in your mouth, it's not actually sweet. That there is nothing about it that makes it sweet. It's your brain telling you that it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, taste is a fascinating thing, and but taste and the various parts of the taste buds and the tongue has everything to do with evolution.
Yeah.
And we developed taste buds because salty, fatty, sugary foods tended to be calorically dense and nutritious back in the day. Now they tend to be just crap, but yeah, and so of course, it tastes good. But once again, these guys, these people who actually talk about this stuff, and whether they believe it or not, I think is up to debate. But the way they present themselves, we are just blank slates. We're nothings, and everything around us is some kind of social construction, and they're not particularly precise in defining what that social construct is, mind you. And I think the problem ultimately with SJWs is their tenacity in continually ignoring evidence. I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, how many times does the pay gap wage myth need to be debunked? Well, apparently 10 million, maybe 10 billion. When does it end? You can continually throw evidence at them because they themselves don't really care about evidence. It's not very effective. So I'm in a sort of a state of despair because of this. I wouldn't say that, but if people don't value evidence whatsoever, even religious people tend to value evidence, in my view, more than social. You'll get devout Muslims allegedly pointing to great scientific truths in the Quran, for example, or in the Bible, in the case of Christians. And I mean, it doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny, but at least they're concerned with evidence.
At least some of them will adapt to their beliefs, such as you get the Christians who say, oh, well, when they say God created the universe in 7 days, a day to God is actually a billion years. So it's simply a matter of perception.
Yeah,
so at least they try in some cases to adapt it.
Yeah, the SJW is it's a giant fantasy world that they live in. And the thing that puzzles me is how they've become so entrenched in society, particularly in academia, in social media, in gaming. I mean, they're everywhere, and they seem to have a powerful voice. And I think how these are a bunch of boogeymen. They're like fucking shamans dancing around the fire. This is how primitive they are, and they have so much influence. It's incredible.
Maybe they are, in fact, part of our feedback loop. They are playing on our own biology, on the what makes us feel good. They know which they know which buttons to press.
I think human beings, I've called this in the past, feel-goodism. And we want to feel good about ourselves. We don't want to confront some of the nastiness that is often on display in human nature. We don't want to, take the idea of love, the mystical love bond. If you actually look at the way humans operate, you don't even, it's very helpful looking at our physiology, but you can just look at cheating and divorce and how it occurs, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that there's some sort of mystical love bond, and yet every Valentine's Day something comes up, it's commercialized, it's almost mythologized, and it makes us feel good. It makes us feel good to think about how special our feelings might be for another person, or how special our feelings might be for our children. And but when in reality, for example, in parental love, it's that's your genetic investment. That's why. People don't like having that reductionist approach. It makes them feel small and unimportant, and that might be true, but it doesn't change the facts.
Yeah, I find the topic of love to be quite an interesting one, actually. And I look at things like Valentine's Day and I say, you're tricking people into basically thinking that their genetic lineage is insured. You're tickling that little switch that all your genes know they desperately want to be passed on because they think they're the best. And you're tickling this idea that people can have. That's like, no, you can have it, and you can have it forever. There will always be the ability to do this because someone will always accept you.
Yeah. Well, and the other aspect, I think there's a cynicism behind it. Let's face it, Valentine's Day is just a glorified spending spree for men to spend money on women the vast majority of the time.
Oh, absolutely. What is it? They spend more by, I think, a ratio of, between like 4 or 7 to 1. I've heard all sorts of numbers, but it's very disproportionately one way.
Yeah, I mean, despite feminist proclamations for equality and going Dutch, and this is, as my recent talk with Professor Mills, if you're interested, you can check that out. It's not too long ago. That's just part of the mating ritual. And so spend, spend, spend. I think on the part of the industry that promotes, say, Valentine's Day or sort of love mythology, it's just cynicism. Same thing with wedding rings and jewelry. They know humans are susceptible to this, and so they try to profit from it, just like everyone else does. But obviously, yeah, people really believe in this stuff. When I was younger, I used to believe in some sort of, that love was special, and there was some super deep connection that it created, and it had almost sort of mystical properties to it. And this is because they don't teach you this stuff in school. You have to teach it yourself. You have to go through the experiences, and then you have to later on read about it and learn about dopamine and serotonin, and that's what's going on. But it's a shame, because I actually think that this kind of stuff should be part of basic education in public schools, for example. That way you have a handle, whether you're male or female, on why you're acting a certain way, your interactions, and you don't get totally lost in it. Because for the MGTOW-minded people out there, I mean, we've talked about MGTOW before, but a lot of this stuff that goes on in MGTOW is the result of having been in really destructive relationships or marriages, not understanding what was going on, because the people didn't have access to the science, they didn't take the time. I think a lot of damage could be spared if we just were much more educated about how we interact, particularly with regards to, say, love and bonding and relationships. I don't think, however, the powers that be, and I'm not a conspiracist, but people who market and commercial shit want people to know the details, because that would take away from the mythology and, of course, their profits.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at it and you say, well, do people always have this mystical love bond? No, of course not. If that was the case, human beings, we would be absolute pair bonders. We would pair bond for life and never look anywhere else ever.
Like swans.
Exactly, and it just doesn't happen. We will cheat on people, even people who are in very deeply entrenched emotional connection to someone else. They can still look. If this bond was genuinely that sort of unshakable, unbreakable, that wouldn't happen. I mean, people might not act on it, but you will certainly turn your head every so often.
And what's really interesting in regards to cheating is they have a pretty good idea of what regulates it. There is a neurotransmitter, vasopressin, which technically speaking is an antidiuretic, but it also has properties, it seems, that allow us to predict how faithful people are. They first did these experiments on voles. The degree of vasopressin secretion seemed, the higher the degree of vasopressin secretion, the more faithful the voles seemed to be. And then they later on ran some experiments on humans and discovered the same thing. Basically, if you have low vasopressin levels, you're much, much, much more likely to cheat, whether you're a male or woman or female. And vice versa, if you have high levels, you're much more of a pair bonder. And so we're getting to the point where we can actually predict this stuff. And it also shows the variety. I mean, human beings have always been, for the length of Homo sapiens, a sort of the in-between ape. We have the second largest testicles after chimpanzees. Common chimpanzees have big testicles because they're very promiscuous, and you need a lot of semen to compete, basically. We don't have as small as, say, gorillas, because gorillas tend to live in harems with one silverback, or somewhere in between. Gibbons, they're lifelong pair bonders, or at least pair bonders for the duration, and there's no real cheating going on. We're just this sort of mixture, and we tend to overemphasize the positive qualities we have. I mean, I don't like to use these terms positive, but the fact that sometimes we are pair bonders and we have these feelings, and we tend to shy away from the nastiness. And this is a bad thing in a way, because unless we look at the nastiness, we will continually get exploited by the powers that be. People that want to sell us junk, for example, on Valentine's Day.
And I think it's actually quite sad that we don't actually embrace this. Again, I like yourself, I don't like to say positive and negative in these regards, because it's all entirely subjective. But, sure, we have this pair bonding tendency, but we also have this cheating and go look for other people tendency. And I think we need to sort of look at both of those and actually embrace both of those sides, because those qualities are what got humans where we are now. It was, it's very possible that it was the apes who went off and cheated who actually got us to being what we are now, because they were the sort of essential mutation that led us where we are. Or it's possible that we were doing something like that before, but we had the pair bonding influence come in via, again, mutation. Yes. Via, again, genetic mutation that would come in. And that sort of led us to being a more successful species in that capacity. So you have to sort of look at both of these sides and say, neither of them is inherently good and neither of them is inherently bad. They are simply both means to the end that we found ourselves at now.
Yeah. But I mean, of course, in a modern context, I mean, both men and women engage, for example, in mate guarding. They do it for different reasons. But very few people are actually thinking, I am, the man doesn't say, I'm engaging in mate guarding because paternity insurance. I'll never know if my child is actually my child, and blah, blah. People don't think along those lines. That's a shame. It's very
subconscious, though.
Oh, yeah, it's deeply.
There was a
really
interesting study I actually read. It was I'm not entirely sure how they did it, but they actually studied couples and their sexual interaction after prolonged absence. And it was universally found that basically couples, if they've not been together for like a week or 2 weeks or a month, will always have more rough sex than if they hadn't had that absence. And it was sort of and it kind of looked at this idea from an evolutionary perspective of saying like, well, this is kind of like partially a territorial thing, but also there's partially this idea of semen competition as well in there.
Sperm
competition in there as well. That the penis is larger, harder, is being inserted deeper. This is starting to sound a little bit filthy, but unfortunately, this would be a truth of it. But it was quite interesting to sort of read that and say like, well, there is something here.
Well, we know, I mean, there are arguments for both sides. I mean, we know, for example, that males who have offspring and interact with offspring tend to have lower testosterone levels, less aggression. And there's evidence to show that, paternal investment was one of the contributing factors to civilization. On the other hand, somewhere upwards of 40% of sperm that is ejaculated during intercourse is there to fight off foreign sperm. And the penis itself is shaped such to sort of scoop out potential rivals. The fact that we're sexually dimorphic. Monogamous species don't really have sexual dimorphism. One male gibbon looks pretty much like a female gibbon, apart from the genitalia. And so we kind of have both of this. And I think a lot of people just don't feel comfortable that we're sort of in between, and we have this nasty side. Because let's face it, on a personal, emotional level, getting cheated on, hurts. If you're in some sort of long-term intimate relationship, it's rare that people say, "Oh, well, my girlfriend or my wife cheated on me because she was trying to optimize her DNA and cuckolded me." And this is not a train of thought most people have. But I wonder sometimes if people actually took the time to understand the basics of, say, the science behind it, if they would be able to cope with things like that better. My inclination is to think that they just wouldn't take the time to bother. But I think it's so important because, yes, we have in the MGTOW community a lot of extremists and some weirdos and whatever. You've dealt with them, but I think most of the MGTOWs that have gone the full mile are much more sort of calm and contemplative about things because we've taken the time to read up on this stuff, to understand it. We're not sort of raging. We're just calmly thinking, okay, that's the way it is. I think that could be a positive approach to a lot of things, especially when it comes to, say, interpersonal reactions between men and women. But as long as there's that barrier of social justice warriors, and particularly because it's so entrenched in academia, I've been out of the loop for a while, but when I talk to young people in their 20s or early 20s, it sounds like there's some sort of feminist, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but a feminist concentration camp going on, basically, where they can't say anything, you can't do anything. It's bizarre.
We do seem to be heading in a direction where society seems to be trying to prune rationale. It seems to be trying to remove people's ability to critically think and analyze things. And a lot of people are sort of being encouraged, like, just go with what you feel. It's like, no, I don't want to go with what I feel, because what I feel is probably going to be the worst course of action.
Yeah. I mean, a friend of mine said once, and I think he's spot on, emotions or feelings are a useful servant but a terrible master. And, when you let yourself be ruled by feelings, the feelings often have nothing to do with the best course of action or a rational approach based on evidence and facts and observation. They tend to be pretty awful overall.
I mean, it's not to say they don't have their place and there's nothing positive about them. I mean, sure, loving people and forming relationships is a great thing. Experiencing happiness is beneficial, experiencing sadness is beneficial, but going too far into them and allowing those things to dictate your actions, it leads you to just being irrational about things. It leads you to making
and dangerous.
Yes,
I can
yes.
relate a story of an ex-girlfriend of mine who, at the time, I actually wasn't, but she claimed, maybe I was subconscious, and claimed I was checking out other women. This was eons ago. And I woke up, luckily, on time before she was, pulling my trousers down with a knife. I can only suppose she was trying to perform some surgery. She had no medical training, mind you, but, she was just going on her feelings. Oh, you were checking out other women, possibly. I'm going to cut your dick off. Not a very rational approach to things.
No, seems completely reasonable. Why would that not be your first port of call in the situation?
Sure, yeah. But you hear stories about I actually experienced this, and that's why I just think feelings they have a use, and they can feel good and be beneficial. But isn't that just the core of this? The SJWs is just all about feels, right? Feelers.
It's specifically for them. It's specifically about, or it seems to be about, trying to feel good all the time. No one should ever be made to experience anything bad or anything adversarial, which I think is probably the most damaging part of their message, because, no, it's through adversary that people grow. Adversary is to take it back full circle, adversarial conditions, be they environmental, social, biological, is the reason why evolution happens. It's the reason why we progress.
Yeah, it's also, it's funny you mention that. That's the impression one gets, that SJWs and people associated with them are kind of stuck in a perpetual childhood, more or less. It's, wishing for the world to be a certain way. Oh, the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, or it's because some of the things they want are just fantastical and have nothing to do with reality. And yeah, they don't understand that struggle, not universally, but very often, ultimately you come out a better person and you improve yourself. I know if I hadn't struggled in my 20s, I wouldn't have learned half the things I learned now. And I just, they just want to avoid all difficulty. The famous example is with slut shaming. The reality is, if you're going to dress promiscuously, men particularly, if you're heterosexual, they're going to check you out. They're hardwired to do that. All the well-wishing in the world isn't going to make that go away. So if you don't want that, then wear your baggy jogging trousers and your hoodie or whatever, and a lot fewer men will check you out. Simple. This isn't about sexism. It's just about reality.
Yeah. And it's funny, when you turn it around and you say, well, if there's this nice muscular guy walking around shirtless, women are going to check him. They won't talk about that, though. Even though happens.
It's the classical double standard of the sort of the Brad Pitt-like guy hitting on a woman. Then it's great because he's got money and looks. But the average height, average looking guy, Joe Schmo, if he hits on her, it's sexual harassment. It's
He's a creeper. That's
yeah.
my favorite
Well,
word.
creepy is a fascinating word. Women like to use this word. I haven't seen the stats, but I'm almost certain women use this word much more than men, and specifically in reference to things they find unappealing about men, and which can just be turned off the minute the man is appealing. And so, Bob is creepy because, I don't know, he's not that tall and he doesn't look like he has a lot of money. But John there, he's 6'2" and he's a lawyer, so he's not a creep. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's even more fascinating that most women don't even know that that's how they're using this language semantically, just changing it back and forth. But it's fascinating.
Yes, how many women would find it creepy if Johnny Depp was the one digging through their bins for their used underwear? Would it be as creepy as if it was some random bearded homeless guy who hasn't washed for a month? I don't think so. I think it would be charming and slightly romantic that he was scared to talk to you directly or something, or any number of excuses that rationalization hamster will spin out.
Yeah, but I mean, this is ultimately what it comes down to: the rationalization hamster, the SJWs, and people associated with them tend to engage in. There's just, and this is why it seems so. Like I said, a bit pessimistic about the prospects. It's just, you hammer away at them over and over and over again. You offer them evidence. I watch your videos. You debunk stuff, and I admire you in some regard. I just don't have the patience. I think there was an SJW on that thread about the language social construct thing, and he or she, I don't know, went on about some race being a social, and I just said, Tildeer is much better at this. I don't have time for people like you.
The race being a social construct is a strange one. It's kind of like, well, it's not really a social construct. It is very definitely a genetic construct. What you mean is it's a subjective interpretation from an individual assessing someone else's possible genetic heritage.
Yeah, but they never talk about it. Or another argument you'll hear from SJWs is that geographical lines are artificial. There's no real line between, I don't know, France and Spain. They just made it up for political reasons. And
okay, mountain ranges and rivers mean nothing, right?
Well, they discount that. And even the cases where there aren't natural barriers, admittedly there are political states that exist and countries, but it's all about being offended. And I know people. I've even called it racist because I pointed out that different groups that have evolved in different climates and areas of the world tend to have developed slightly different physiologies, and even some things that other people don't have. In the case of Western Africans, with their propensity for sprinting, the ATP gene, you don't really find that in other groups. Very rare, and so I'm a racist because I say that. I don't really draw any conclusions beyond that other than observation. Okay, so that's the case. But just like there's a preponderance of long-distance runners from Eastern Africa, but apparently the reason why they're able to do that is because it's a social construct.
Yeah. You do have to question something. It's like, so it's just an odd coincidence that people native to really hot, sunny areas have darker skin than people who are from areas with less sunlight. It has nothing to do with the efficiency of processing vitamin D, which was essential for the survival of those people. Nothing to do with that at all. It's entirely an arbitrary thing, no doubt caused by white people.
Yeah. I mean, there's also a notion, I think, that as long as you're not white and you harbor negative sentiments towards certain people, you can't be racist. I know Sargon of Akkad sometimes talks about this, but I just don't know, how do you combat something like that? It's just
that's an interesting thing. It's to do with the redefinition of words. I actually had someone questioned me on that. I wonder if I could quickly find the comment which I wrote in reply to them. It's to do with this idea that they will constantly redefine words to basically try and twist their meaning. Let's see if I can find this. Yeah, here we go. Let's see if I can find the part where I start talking about the words. That doesn't matter. I'll see if I can quickly skim it while I talk through. But it was basically this idea that they'll take a word that has a very distinct negative connotation. Like they'll take the term rape, and a social justice warrior will put into that. They'll include things like having sex while drunk. So they will say that someone is a rapist because they had sex with an intoxicated person, even though the intoxicated person consented, and then maybe they went on to or were already in a relationship with the supposed rapist. You then sort of find yourself in this strange situation where the social justice warrior calls someone a rapist by their definition, and the instant image in the mind of everyone else around who uses the sort of generally agreed and legal definition of rape, the forceful sex, lots of coercion, the stereotypical get jumped, dragged into an alley, crowbar over the neck and told if you make a sound you'll be killed sort of thing. And everyone around will assume that that's what the accused has done, because that's the sort of image that word invokes. But the social justice warrior is just using the sort of watered-down, expansive definition that few others use. So it's kind of like, in essence, they get to accuse someone of being something considerably worse than they are. So, yeah, that's sort of what I get with it.
Do you foresee a time when their absurdity becomes so extreme and just so overwhelming that even the people that normally supplicate them and listen to their garbage just say, oh, this is just too much, time to move on? Because let's face it, this sort of thinking is entrenched in governments, in academic institutions, and indeed in the public consciousness as well. You're slowly seeing people pushing back. Obviously, guys like you responding to them and pointing out the flaws in their logic. But I wonder sort of on the ground if people are just going to say, this is so absurd, I can't even listen to this anymore. Time to move on.
Well, less than 20% of people consider themselves to be feminists, and most social justice proponents are feminists, and that number is coming down and down and down, so I think people are just getting sick of it, slowly.
Yeah. Although, something that's been often talked about in the MGTOW community is the idea that, there are plenty of women that aren't declared feminists, but how many of those women would give up the welfare checks, the 4 times greater funding for breast cancer versus prostate? I think the real battle to see if we can achieve some level of parity in, and at least less discrepancy in really how much the sexes suffer in society, particularly men. Because we look at the homeless, mostly men, military casualties, vast majority men, male specific diseases, they don't get the same funding. And I always just have to ask myself the question, many women might not be declared feminists, but how many of them would actually forego their special benefits they receive as women in order to create a so-called egalitarian society? My suspicion is precious few.
Would they give up gynocentrism?
Essentially, yeah. It's tough. It's like saying you live in a posh flat, but if here in the name of egalitarianism we'll move you to a place that's a third of the size or half the size or whatever.
It's more like you live in this luxury flat. Okay, cool. We're going to put a wall here and a wall there, and 2 other people are going to live here with you.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I think if men received the same benefits, they would be in the same position. I don't think they ever will, but It's just a very difficult thing. And one thing, at least some of the more rational MGTOWs have tried to do is really to look at feminism and look past it and think, well, yeah, there's feminism, but there's also an overwhelming gynocentric tendency to supplicate female desire. You see it in voting patterns. You see it in medical expenses. You see it in, you pointed out how many domestic abuse shelters are there for men compared to women.
Well, I don't know if you saw my latest video, which I put up, I think it was this morning or yesterday. That was basically all it was. It was a feminist harping on about how men didn't speak up when a men's rights charity lost its funding. And it was just like, well, why didn't you point it out? Why didn't feminists point this out? And I've actually in the video, I Google search about half a dozen of the top feminist websites. Not one of them mentioned it.
Yeah, and I think the everyday woman might not be a feminist, but and sort of declared feminist, but I just don't think it's likely she's going to look for any sort of real egalitarian system which is, it's not achievable. We're always going to see more male bums than female bums. And,
I think it just comes back to the inherent selfishness of people.
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
not, if you've got a privilege or an advantage, you're not going to want to give it up.
No, I don't think I would either. If I were some young hot chick, I mean, I joke about this with a friend. My gaming channel will probably never grow, but if I were some young hot chick, 21, blonde hair, big tits, wear a tank top, I would use that to my advantage. I'd start a gaming channel. Yeah, it would just be eye candy, but I'd get tens of thousands of subs. So I don't necessarily fault them for it, because I probably do the same thing in their shoes. But the reality is, I think even if feminism is defeated, whatever that means, not much in the actual gender dynamics of society and the world is going to change. I mean, we're still, it's still men who are going to have their legs blown off in combat and end up bums on the street. And I think it's unfortunate, particularly because there's nothing we can really do about it.
Well, it is that feminism ultimately does seem to be. I know a lot of MGTOW like to say that it's a manifestation of female nature, but I disagree. I look at it and say, no, it's a very extreme manifestation and extrapolation of human nature in general. Feminism couldn't exist if it was only women doing it. Men have to be enabling it as well.
Well, right, but I think there's a little bit of separation there. The men who are enabling it.
Certainly, if you're going to benefit from it, you'll be more inclined to support it than the people who aren't. But it's still a two-sided thing.
I think it appeals men who are feminist or who somehow believe the story. It just appeals, and we're all told the story as young people. It appeals to the male because men have a natural desire to protect and provide for women. And I think Girl Writes What pointed this out many times, particularly in earlier videos, that feminism is one of the biggest con jobs ever, because it tells the world that women who historically at least have been able to survive at much better rates than men have been oppressed, and have been systematically oppressed. And men are inclined to believe that because men want to provision women and give them stuff. And I think so yeah, you're absolutely right. Without men putting these laws into effect and supporting it, there would be no feminism. I mean, there would be nothing without men allowing it. Men are the building blocks of civilization. Without men letting stuff happen, it wouldn't happen. But fortunately for feminists, men are very partial to women, and men let things like that happen. So it's I do actually believe that because feminism is all about feelings, it's how you feel. Women are very much wired that way. They're much more inclined to talk about their feelings than objective facts, generally speaking, than men are. The famous women are more emotional, and feminism is completely emotional. So I do think there's an element of female nature in feminist ideology that wouldn't necessarily be present in a corresponding male ideology. You still get selfishness. I just think that female selfishness and male selfishness can be somewhat distinct sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. But I think the distinction is more in how they are facilitated.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Like one is basically accepted and the other isn't. If you're a man and you're
yeah,
selfish, you're a douchebag. If you're a woman and you're selfish, oh, she's an empowered woman looking out for herself.
but that's the whole point. It's you don't really see people praising male selfishness, but
Yeah, 'cause if you're a
when
man,
women,
I actually read that on a feminist website. I can't remember which one it was, but it was like, no, if you're a man and you don't want to have kids, then you're selfish. You're denying a woman her happiness. And there was another one. It was, oh, there are too many well-educated women out there going to university and getting degrees, and they don't want to date down to men who don't have degrees. And their basic tagline was, come on, men, get to it. You need to go and get yourselves an education so that women will find you desirable.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Nice to know that you've got yourself into the problem and it's men's fault to fix it for you. Okay.
Well, this has been studied a number of times. I mean, the greater the income, the education levels of women, it doesn't, like feminists might claim, level out or become even. No, they want men who are even more educated than them. They want men who make even more money than them. I mean, that's hypergamy.
Mm.
But the fact that nobody calls women, actually, people might want to, but they're afraid of calling women out on this behavior, is it's a shame. In fact, the only people that are effective at calling women out on this kind of behavior are women like Karen Strawn, Girl Writes What? Because if you're a guy, you're a misogynist, you're
a sexist who can't get laid.
Sexist pig, you can't get laid, you're an asshole, your mother hated you, whatever. So but when it comes from a woman, I mean, that's the thing. The irony is when...
This is why they invented internalized misogyny, though.
Yeah, well, right. I forgot about that.
That's,
I think Girl Writes What got that a couple of times.
Yeah, that's what they've pulled out for us. Like, if you're a woman and you think this, it's because you're a misogynist, you hate women, despite the fact that you're a woman. It's because you're a self-hating woman. That's a simple explanation, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it's just baffling.
Again, it's the emotional argument. It's not the you've looked at data and come to a rational conclusion. It's the no, you feel something.
Yeah, I'll never forget a video that Girl Writes What made years ago. Maybe it was in 2012, but where she was talking about crime rate. There was an article about crime rates in British Columbia and Canada and how people were aghast because women were at risk at almost the same level as men. This was of being mugged at some particular neighborhood, I think it was, and some great revelation. Here you had men constantly suffering greater incidents of muggings, but because women all of a sudden almost were at risk, and it just goes to show how primitive I think another thing Girl Writes What has pointed out, feminism is very primitive. It's all about feel. It's not looking at the world objectively. It's creating a narrative.
They can be very objective when they want to be.
Yeah, I suppose.
9 men die at work for every 1 woman. Okay, great. What are we going to do about it? Let's get the number of male deaths at work down. Okay, one man dies and 1 woman dies at work. Women make up 50% of workplace deaths. Unacceptable.
Yeah. It's quite the boogeyman. I don't really know how to defeat it, if it's even possible to defeat it, because feminism panders to men in the sense that that is, men tend to be sympathetic towards the female plight, and it panders to women's sense of victimhood that women tend to be much more afraid of things in general than men are. And you tell them these things, these scary facts, 1 in 4, blah, 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 and they react to it emotionally, usually.
Mm.
So it's a great con job. It's a con job on men and women. And the only inkling of hope I have is that when we actually want to make real progress in the human sciences, like cognitive science or evolutionary psychology or whatever, there's going to come a point in time where you need to set aside all this feminist ideology and just deal with how things actually are.
Mm.
I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this was years ago at a conference, saying, I'm not too worried about religious people having an effect on the government, because at the end of the day, the government wants science that gets things done. So maybe that might be the silver lining in the cloud of obscurity that we're facing.
Maybe. I mean, I'm sort of looking at it and thinking maybe we just need more of an acceptance approach, because I know a lot of social justice warriors, they love to just smack down evolutionary psychology, just be like, no, it's a bunch of nonsense, biological fatalism, rah, 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 and so on and so forth. It's kind of like, no, guys, your social sciences and all of that stuff, evolutionary psychology is actually kind of this umbrella that's sort of welcoming it in to the hard sciences, as long as you can prove your claims.
Yeah, and I just talked about Professor Mills. So evolutionary psychology is falsifiable. I mean, for example, there are tons of studies showing some mating preferences of men and women across the globe, cross-culturally. Everywhere you name it, they tend to be very, very similar. How could you falsify that? Well, easy. You find similar numbers all over the globe where, women like short, low-status men that they can take care of and mother all the time. I mean, we don't find that. So you could falsify that, which is we haven't found the evidence to falsify for what we know about human mating tendencies and preferences. There are people who are sort of the eternal agnostics and just claim that we can know nothing about human behavior because it's just sort of miasma of the unknown. But if you actually take time to read the studies, they tend to be pretty rigorous. And they in one case, I thought was fascinating, the conversation that Sargon of Akkad had with Professor Saad, where, once again, it mentioned that in male-on-male competition, the male who wins tends to have higher testosterone levels than the other one. And he ran an experiment, I think it was in Montreal, where they had one guy drive around in a sort of beaten-up jalopy and another guy in a Porsche. And after they drove around a whole bunch, they tested their testosterone levels. And lo and behold, the male in the Porsche had elevated, and the man in the shitty car had much lower levels, below the normal levels he would otherwise have. So you can actually test these hypotheses. But most people don't want to even take the time to look at it or discuss it. It's much easier just to say, oh, it's all made up, it's all bullshit.
But it rather conveniently goes full circle back to what we were saying at the beginning about this feedback cycle. It's like, okay, you're the guy with the nice resource, you're the guy with the shitty resources. One of you has higher testosterone, one has lower. If you then breed as a result of this, then that's going to be passing on.
Yeah.
And so the feedback loop, well, it's there. It's undeniable, because men with high testosterone, they do tend to breed more than lower testosterone men. Or they're more likely to. It's certainly stacked in their favor.
Yeah.
So, we have this instance again. We have the neuroplasticity of the brain. It's responding to a stimulus. And that stimulus then has a result, which is passed on. I fail to see how people can't acknowledge this, but they will go out their way not to.
Well, what did Morgan Freeman's character in Seven say? Most people just want to play the lotto, watch television, eat cheeseburgers. So I think that's part of the problem.
Ignorance is bliss. It really is.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the human sciences, the cognitive sciences, or Evo Psych, it's just not pleasant knowing some of this stuff.
Goes back quite nicely to our first talk about forbidden knowledge. The idea that some things are better off not to be known.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't want to destroy the mystical love bond you have because, you mean, he or she might cheat and I could be being cuckolded and wait, that might not be my children. I mean, nobody wants to think about that stuff. Well, nobody. Some people. Many people don't.
Some people have a very particular fetish for that. I will never understand.
Yeah. But this is the problem. People want to feel good, and all the feel-goodites, unfortunately, are blockades to actually understanding how the world works. And I would propose that if we could move past all this feel-goodism, we could maybe overall eventually become happier and more content because we could accept reality on its own terms. And in accepting that, we could work within the context of reality rather than denying it to optimize ourselves, you know?
And definitely does seem to be a sort of ideal way of doing it. Just actually look at things from as a rational standpoint as possible. Again, not to say that emotions don't have a time or a place or a purpose, but it does seem to be that the more you can minimize them, actually, the happier people seem to be because they actually have, because by sort of looking at things as rationally as possible, that's when you actually have the least sort of conflict of things. That's when things actually get smoothest.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, personally, anecdotally, that's certainly been the case. I was much more emotional in my 20s and or teen, obviously. You know, you get older, hormonal levels drop, but yeah, I certainly feel more content and just a greater sense of equilibrium than I ever did in the raging 20s. Because I just kind of take a dispassionate view of most things. Not to say I don't have any feelings, but you know, life is easier to live in a certain way when you're just looking at things without being emotionally invested in them. I find it's not something many people are partial to, but I found it contributes to my contentment, and I just feel better overall. Yeah.
It does seem to be a sort of way that I approach things as well, and I find that when you do that, the sort of times that you do then sort of switch off the rationale and sort of engage in something emotional, it becomes a lot more fulfilling and enjoyable because it becomes like a bit of a treat, a bit of a pleasure then. It's kind of like, no, I'm going to accept the fact that I'm going to watch this movie and make myself sad, or I'm going to listen to this piece of music I really enjoy and feel happiness.
Yeah. And the thing is, one can do that and then just appreciate that sort of the process of, I know what's going on. I know, for example, that serotonin is being put out because of X, Y, Z. We can still appreciate it, I think. And as you said, it is like a treat. It's like a dessert, rather than just getting overwhelmed and being dominated by your emotions and pulled in every which way, every direction. It's so destructive to not be at least partially in control of your emotions, and in particular letting your emotions direct you. It can lead quite literally to your death in many cases.
But then we come down to, I suppose some people would falsely dichotomize this as some sort of Puritan versus hedonist debate.
Would they? I mean, you'd be a rational hedonist.
Well, I would imagine that there could be, but this idea of sort of being open to your emotions at all times and indulging in them, the more hedonistic approach, as opposed to the sort of more Puritan approach, which I know some people have tried to label it as, I think you have been called the monk of MGTOW and so on and so forth. For this reason, you're being a bit of a Puritan. You're not engaging in emotions at any time. As we said, to go back full circle, people like to dichotomize things.
People love. I recently made a reasonably emotional video. I don't think there was much sort of insightful content. Well, I think it was creative, but people do react to emotions. My experience in terms of videos I make and just dialogue with people much more positively than just sort of laying out facts. I made the statement in a talk. I said, sometimes, I'm paraphrasing, sometimes women's behavior disgusts me. I didn't use the term evil or anything. Sometimes it disgusts me. And then some guy writes this comment saying, oh, it was amazing that you said that. Why? Because I'm also a human being, and occasionally feelings of disgust come up to me. Well, it's nice to know that you're not a robot, and you're sometimes you feel stuff.
Again, it's nice to indulge sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm just a human being too. At the end of the day, I have all the drivers and other things going on in the hardware that other people do. I'm just I try to be aware of them. But yeah, I am referred to as the monk of MGTOW sometimes. But whatever, it works for me in my monkishness.
But it's one of those things. Like, no, if that's the sort of lifestyle that you find makes you the happiest and makes you the most productive that you can be, what's wrong with it?
Yeah. Well, I honestly don't know, and I think most of the hostility towards me came from the Great Sandman. So it's just different. Most people in the MGTOW community don't harbor any sort of negative feelings towards me because I live a relatively monkish lifestyle. But in Sandman's particular case, he had some beef with me, which does occur sometimes. So. But it is getting late here, at least.
Indeed.
I think we're winding down right now. I was very pleased that, one, there were no, knock on wood, internet issues this time. As you actually tried this earlier today, and it didn't work, but it worked pretty well now. So that was great. And, it's always a pleasure to talk to the furry, teal-covered Cervid. So, yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for talking. And to the audience, thanks for listening. Anything you'd like to add?
No, just as usual, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be here. My very patriarchal privilege.
Yeah. Well, you do have the antlers. That probably is the symbol of your patriarchal power. So. All right, guys. We will talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye.